Hello and welcome to Track Changes. I'm Murray Griffin and today I'm down at the port just watching the ships go back and forth, and I've got with me Dr. Franziska Curran. Hello, Franziska.
Hi, Murray. How are you going?
Good. And thanks very much for joining me on the program today. We are going to be talking to two people who know a lot about the issue of shipping and emissions. First up, we're going to be talking to Andrew Dickson. And Andrew had some very interesting things to say, didn't he, Franziska?
He did. It's a very exciting space that he's working in and has recently been researching after coming back from his Churchill Fellowship.
Yes, and he's been looking at wind. He's been looking at what is known by the acronym of WASP, Wind-Assisted Shipping Propulsion. So he has been looking at some pretty amazing technology, new technology that's emerging to cut maritime emissions. And it's pretty exciting.
It's very cool. That's right. I think he said that it can cut emissions by 10 to 40% in some cases, or in that range of pre-existing ships, which is very cool.
It is extraordinary. And then after that, we're going to talk to Mark Tilley, who knows the policy side of all this inside out, because he's the Asia Pacific editor for Carbon Pulse, and he'll be telling us about really crucial developments at the international level that will have an impact on what companies are required to do to cut maritime emissions. And now this topic is, I'm basically a landlubber, Franziska, I have to confess, although at the age of 12, I did single-handedly in a tiny sabo, which I think is a boat that's about, I don't know, maybe just over 2 meters. 2 meters. It's tiny. A
cute little boat. What did you do?
I single-handedly sailed that onto the tiny lake that's in the middle of Albert Park in Melbourne, equipped with nothing but a ham and cheese sandwich and an orange. So that is basically the full extent of my engagement in sailing. But for you, it's quite different. Tell us a bit about your connection.
Oh, yeah. Well, Murray, I love sailing. It's something that does connect really deeply with the people who are addicted, those ocean lovers, those sea lovers who like being around the ocean. So for me, it started in over a decade ago, but over when I participated in a program called the Young Endeavour, which is a Navy training, a Navy-run program where young people spend just under 2 weeks living on board a tall ship called the STS Young Endeavour and learning to sail it. So this is massive 44-metre-long boat with 2 massive masts, one with yard sails, these huge square sails hanging from horizontal bars. And that really, I got the bug. I really caught it then and have been sailing smaller boats ever since. And so there's something about having wind in the sails and wind assist or wind propulsion in the ocean that's really quite exciting to me.
Yes, well, that does sound very exciting. And clearly I am the odd person out in this episode because you are very engaged in sailing, have that wonderful experience with the Young Endeavour. Andrew Dickson, who we're going to be talking to, has an amazing connection with sailing and did work for quite a few years with the Navy. And Mark Tilley was also a sea scout in his youth. Anyway, so yes, there's a lot of love for the sea in this episode, and a lot of interest in exploring ways that we can cut emissions from commercial shipping. So let's go find out what Andrew had to say.
Let's do it. Hello, Andrew, and welcome to Track Changes.
Thank you. Good to be here.
First up, Andrew, tell us a bit about your career so far and what has been a career highlight for you.
Yeah, well, I actually started my career in the Australian Navy. I joined straight from school when I was 17, went to the Defence Academy in Canberra and did an engineering degree in electrical and electronics engineering. And I mean, through my childhood, that's pretty much all I wanted to do. I fell in love with the sea. I spent my childhood growing up sailing and racing boats off the coast of Adelaide. My dad was involved as a defence research scientist and invented something quite important for the Navy. So the Navy seemed like a natural fit for me. I trained for 5 years in Canberra and then spent another 5 years on warships and bases and dockyards around the country. But I had a medical setback which changed my career trajectory. I had corneal transplants in both eyes. That stopped me going to sea and progressing my career. But in the end, these sorts of things can be, setbacks can be opportunities, and that's what it was for me. It gave me the opportunity to develop a fabulous life ashore. I did lots of things, including discovering Tibetan Buddhism. I did a pilgrimage to India. It was all very fascinating. For a little while, I actually considered becoming a Buddhist monk, but I realized that I was more of an organizer than a meditator. So I sort of dropped that idea. And I worked for a few years for a friend who just launched a startup called Reach Out, which is it's a youth suicide prevention initiative using the internet, quite innovative back in the day. And I realized through that experience that I like dealing with people as much as I like technology. So I think of myself more as a people-y engineer than a techie engineer.
Oh, that totally resonates.
Yeah. Anyway, after Reach Out, at a friend's suggestion, I saw a vocational psychologist and did the aptitude testing. And the psychologist suggested that I might be good at innovation, which is something I'd never really thought of before. I enrolled in a master's degree in science and technology commercialization at Adelaide Uni, and I moved back to Adelaide for the first time in years. And that ended up being really fortunate timing. I landed a job with a wind farm development company called Wind Prospect in the really early days of wind farm development in Australia, which was really humming in South Australia at that time. I became the development manager for the Snowtown wind farm, which I'd actually nominate as my chosen career highlight, even though it was over 20 years ago. And the reasons are that it really strongly aligned with my values of sustainability. It played to my strengths of being an organizer and a doer. It was technical, but also about people. I could see the benefits that these projects bring to landowners and communities. And so I saw that project all the way through, from early development through construction and into commercial operations. So that was really the bedrock for my career since then. My thinking broadened when I had a Swiss adventurer stay with me and my wife at our house. He was driving a solar electric car around the world. It was called the Solar Taxi. It was a 3-wheeled little electric car towing a trailer with a large solar array. So I sort of realized that solar was a thing as well as wind. I ended up leading Wind Prospect into solar development, initially solar thermal. Kevin Rudd's government introduced something called solar flagships to really go big on solar. It was a competitive process with lots of funding on offer, one stream for solar PV and another for solar thermal. I was part of a consortium which eventually won the thermal stream for a project called Solar Dawn. It was near Chinchilla, west of Brisbane. 3 really intense years, lots of red-eye flights, got pneumonia 3 years in a row from working so damn hard. But we were successful. We were awarded over $400 million of funding from the federal government and about $70 million from the Queensland government. But, as happens, the politics changed, both at the state and federal levels. The funding evaporated, and then the project eventually died. And at that time, Tony Abbott began the climate wars. So it was a good time to step out of renewables. So I joined the South Australian government for a few years, doing economic development and investment attraction. But I eventually got the call to come back to renewables when the politics improved, and renewables projects came out of hibernation. I became involved with really large-scale export-oriented renewable projects in Western Australia, which essentially sought to harness the untapped renewable resources in remote desert sites close to the sea, convert the renewable electricity into molecules, so hydrogen and derivatives of hydrogen like ammonia, and then load it onto ships and export it, kind of like LNG but without carbon. And I did that for 9 years until May this year.
Wow, what a fascinating career journey. And I love hearing how it sort of evolved with your, I guess, for want of a better word, discovery of your values or in line with your values and kind of grew and changed. So, and that obviously took you up till just a couple of months ago when you undertook a Churchill Fellowship, which I think you just came back from. So what exactly is a Churchill Fellowship and what was the focus of yours?
Yeah, so I finished up my job on a Friday in late May, and the next Thursday I was on a plane to start a 6-week Churchill Fellowship, so it all worked out really well. I traveled, I traveled initially to Singapore, then off to the UK, France, the Netherlands, Germany, Denmark, and then eventually to the Marshall Islands in the Pacific. So for those who aren't aware, a Churchill Fellowship gives funding to Australians to travel overseas to deep dive into a topic they're passionate about, with the aim of bringing back new knowledge and ideas that can benefit Australia and local communities. I really encourage listeners to consider applying for their own Churchill Fellowship, regardless of their profession, their age, their gender, or whatever. It's completely open to all, and it's a real gift. And I should mention, actually, that my fellowship was paid for by a private benefactor, Henry Rishpith, who did his own fellowship a couple of decades ago. So thank you, Henry. And the topic of my fellowship was maritime decarbonisation, but specifically using wind-assisted ship propulsion. And it's an area that I discovered a couple of years ago. And I discovered there's heaps of innovation underway in this area, which is, I was completely unaware. But I really wanted to deep dive and learn more and see how I could contribute to it. Because as I mentioned, I grew up sailing. I had 10 years in the Navy and over 20 years as a wind farm developer. So I know the power of the wind. And I'm just sure that can make a difference to shipping, decarbonisation. And I really got the chance to meet some of the key global innovators.
Awesome. And I love that it enabled you to explore a really meaningful angle to a big challenge and an angle that aligned with a number of your passions and interests and backgrounds. I guess a lot of people, when they talk about cutting emissions from commercial shipping, this massive feat, they talk about using alternative fuels like green ammonia, e-fuels, e-methanol, and the sort of diversification of fuels that we're going to need to do that. What made you decide wind-assisted shipping was something you wanted to study in depth?
Yeah, so I've spent the last 9 years of my life living this life, trying to develop hydrogen-based fuels to help decarbonise hard-to-abate sectors like shipping and steelmaking, which is a great idea in theory, but it really relies on having really cheap renewable electricity. And it turns out that Australia is an expensive place to develop large infrastructure projects, unfortunately. And we're competing against much lower cost jurisdictions like the Middle East and China and India. And really, the economics of these fuels just aren't compelling yet. So as an example, if we were to replace 1 tonne of conventional shipping fuel, you'd need to, and you replaced it with ammonia, you'd need about 2.5 tonnes of ammonia for the same calorific value. And the ammonia will be 3 or 4 times the cost per tonne compared to regular fuel. So the new fuel bill will be over 10 times more expensive. So it's not going to fly today. But also, the supply chains for these fuels will be very complex and it will take a long time to scale. I do think that in time these fuels will be needed, frankly, when we're a lot more serious about decarbonisation than we are today. So it's probably where we'll need to end up. But in my view, we need to start somewhere else to have early impact.
Yeah, to get started now. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And shift the dial now. And the fellowship really taught me that wind-assisted ship propulsion is a real thing and it's already scaling. And of course, wind is available everywhere. It's available today. It has zero fuel cost and it's available at the point of use on the ship. So there's no bunkering, no supply chains are needed for that. And it can save 10 to 20% of shipping fuel costs and emissions on many ships, and in many cases, much more than 10 to 20%. So it's a good place to start.
And that's pretty significant for, a first step too. So, yeah, it would be great to step it out a bit and paint the broader picture. So could you tell us a bit about the global shipping sector, how large it is, the fuels it uses, and the scale of the sector's emission?
Yeah, so it's a sector that's sort of largely out of sight, out of mind for most people. But there's over 100,000 merchant ships. In fact, approaching 110,000 ships, over 100 gross tons. But they're larger vessels over 300 gross tons. There's again almost 70,000 of them. And obviously there's lots of different types of ships. There's about 12,000 oil tankers, both for the crude oil and the refined products. There's about 13,000 bulk carriers for coal, iron ore, grains, etc. There's about 6,000 container ships. And then, a bit less than 1,000 roll-on, roll-off ships for car carriers and truck carriers, and then about 300 cruise ships. But interestingly, about a third of all shipping is transporting energy around, so coal, oil, and gas.
That's a lot. That's surprising. Yeah.
Yeah, and the shipping of energy is actually the largest single category of global seaborne trade, even ahead of bulk agricultural goods and container ships. But and as we electrify and renewables and transportation, presumably the need for coal, oil, and gas will decline, and that will reduce the shipping volume and the requirements for fuels.
And so, in addition to the decarbonisation that's happening, you're also seeing a change, flow-on effects, and the change of what global shipping is actually doing, what it's moving around.
Exactly. So again, a third of it is shipping fossil fuels. As we wean off the fuels, that changes shipping fundamentally. So it's very interesting. Now, in terms of fuels, the most common types of fuels are, initially heavy fuel oil, which is kind of bottom of the barrel stuff, really. It's thick, viscous oil left over from refining crude oil. And it's mainly been the dominant fuel for very large ocean-going ships. And it's the cheapest, but it's also the most polluting. In 2020, the IMO, International Maritime Organization, introduced a reform to reduce the sulfur content of fuel. So very low sulfur fuel oil is another fuel that's commonly used. Smaller vessels tend to use another product called marine gas oil. And then a number of U ships use LNG. But again, that's not the methane slip is a big problem. And it's not the answer to maritime decarbonisation because methane is still a dirty gas.
It's sort of only an interim solution on the path.
Yeah. But I mean, you have to invest so much to embark on a new fuel. So it's really not a long-term solution, unfortunately. And in terms of volume, shipping uses about 300 million tonnes of fuel per year. And that equates to about 5 or 6 million barrels of oil a day. And cumulatively, shipping emits about 3% of global CO2 emissions, about 1 billion tonnes annually. Wow. And if it was a country, shipping would have the 6th highest emissions, even greater than the emissions of Germany, for example. Yeah, and it is a very conservative sector with tight margins, and ships last for several decades, so it really takes a long time to turn the ship around, so to speak.
Nice. I see what you did there, Andrew.
Thank you. Well done. But having said that, shipping is more progressive about decarb than the aviation sector is. And frankly, it has a broader...
Which is comparable in size, I think.
It is,
roughly
that's right.
3% as well, is
That's right. Yep. But shipping also has more options. It has more alternative fuels and technologies, including wind propulsion, that just simply aren't possible in commercial aviation.
Andrew, so wind-assisted commercial shipping, it does sound like there's a huge amount of potential there. But could you talk about what these wind-assisted ships look like? Because they don't just look like a sort of an old school sailing ship, do they?
No. So, I mean, just for context, until coal and then oil, about 100 years ago or so, wind-powered ships were pretty much all we had. It was very effective, but it lacked the convenience and safety of modern ships, which was only partly to do with sails, frankly. Oil almost completely displaced wind propulsion for over a century, as fossil fuels did in many sectors. But these technologies are making a comeback in a modern incarnation. There are actually lots of different types of wind propulsion technologies, and I should say from the outset that none of them involve installing wind turbines on ships, as I first imagined.
That's what I first imagined too. Embarrassingly,
not that.
Didn't.
Everyone starts there. So, I mean, you'd have an image of sort of Sydney to Hobart boats with soft sails, and there are actually quite a lot of smaller wind-powered ships with soft sails. But there are lots of other things that are kind of counterintuitive. For example, Flettner rotors. They're tall, thin cylinders that have electric motors in them that spin the rotors around on the long axis, and they actually generate lift using a thing called the Magnus effect, which was demonstrated by a German engineer before World War II. So they're making a comeback. There are wing sails which kind of look like aircraft wings, sort of flipped up to be vertical, and they have several solid sections that can kind of move to create lift. Then there are suction sails, which are similar to wing sails, but they have an electric fan at the top that sort of sucks air up through the column, and that creates more lift with the sails, and they're quite popular too. There are various variations of soft sails. For example, one company called North Windships has a modern-looking square rig ship called the Dyna Rig, which is mostly used on very exclusive sort of high net worth sort of super yachts. And at the other extreme, there are Indo rigs, which are soft sails, but on a rectangular they're rectangular rather than triangular, and they're affixed between steel frames. And then finally, kites for going downwind. So, yeah, there's lots of innovation, lots of types of technology. It's a very innovative space.
It sounds incredible. I would like to see a sort of maritime expo, one of each all together. That would be amazing. Can you tell us how many wind-assisted ships are currently operating and which of these technologies they're using? And how quickly can we expect to see this technology scale up?
Yeah, so there are currently about 74 large merchant ships with wind propulsion technologies installed.
Really?
And there are 10 more that are wind ready, or as we used to say in the Navy, fitted for but not with. Mm-hmm. So they're ready for installation. And this corresponds to about 4 million deadweight tons of shipping. So it's non-trivial. But there are also about 130 more ship installations on order, most of them for delivery either this year or next year. So by the end of this year, we should have 100 ships installed with this technology, and the installed capacity doubles roughly every year. It really has the same feel to me as the very early days of solar PV.
Wow,
really,
that's amazing.
Modest growth initially, but then growing exponentially. So that's the stage we're at.
Okay. And presumably these technologies, they can be retrofitted to existing ships or to a large number of existing ships, or are they only suitable for new ships?
Yeah, that's a good question. One of the main benefits of this technology is that it can be retrofitted to existing ships because there's no fuel systems to consider. You don't need to change the engine or types of fuel that you bunker. The structural components are pretty manageable. And these sails and masts can actually fold down often or move side to side or fore and aft, and that enables them to get out of the way for loading. And you don't really need that many changes to crew training, so it's because it's generally computer controlled. But having said that, as we get further into new build wind assisted ships, I think we'll see lots of changes to hull shapes to allow better performance, changes in the design of the rudders, the shape of the hulls, keels, deck designs, etc. We're really in the early days, and there's lots of gains to be made as we embrace it and refine it and scale it.
Andrew, you talked about, there's a huge range of different wind technologies that are suited to particular types of shipping. Are there certain technologies that suit certain types of journeys?
Yeah, there absolutely are. So, the different technologies I described before, they all perform differently in different wind conditions. And mostly it's a matter of how close they can sort of sail into the wind. At one extreme, kites are pretty much only used for pulling a ship downwind, but they're sort of useless if you're going into the wind or sideways. An old style square rig ship, again, is mostly for downwind, but it can also head up a little bit into the wind on what's called a reach with the sailors in the audience. Mm-hmm. A Flettner rotor, again, is also really good when the wind is across the beam, the side of the ship, but it's not good for going into the wind. And suction sails and wing sails perform much better upwind than other technology, so they're more versatile, but more expensive. When I was in Copenhagen, I sort of discussed the complexities of these systems with a senior naval architect from a ship design firm called Nud E. Hansen. And I asked him essentially, does wind-assisted ship propulsion make sense for commercial ships? And his answer sort of kept it real. He said, look, yes, it can make sense, absolutely. but it depends on many things. For example, the vessel type, the voyage routes and speeds, the prevailing winds, the ports, the appetite of the ship owner or charterer, and so much more. So, yes, but was his answer.
Yeah.
And at one extreme, large container ships are probably the hardest use case for wind assistance, partly because they sail just too fast. They're very quick ships, and the apparent wind goes too far forward, so that cuts out most of the available technology. Those sorts of ships need lots of cranes for loading and unloading, and sails would just get in the way.
Yeah.
They don't have the structural supports because they just stack the containers, one on top of the other, so there's nowhere to mount the sails. But, smaller feeder container ships, yes, we are starting to see some appear, but not on the large ships that we sort of typically see in Australia. But the good news is that bulkers and tankers, they can be really easily retrofitted with these technologies. And as I mentioned before, there's over 20,000 of those two ships together. And this is where the current installations are really starting to scale.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's exciting news. So what will the impact be? I mean, you did touch on this earlier, but what difference can it make in terms of reducing emissions from shipping?
We're reaching the point now where real data is being published on how they actually perform, not sort of marketing promises. And it's not unusual for particularly rotors. There's probably more rotors than anything else. A global average fuel saving over a long-term basis is around 10%. So it reduces the fuel use by 10%. But, again, in good conditions, which can happen for many days in a row, it can be up to 40%. So it's kind of in that range, 10 to 40%. To quantify the benefits from just one technology, they're called wind wings from Bar Technologies in the UK.
Yeah.
Each wing can save around 1.5 tons of fuel per day, and that saves around 4.5 tons of CO2 per day per sail. So
really,
yeah, big ships typically have 2 to 4 sails, and remember there are thousands of ships that can have these. So more than 20,000 combined. So you can get a sense of the scale of the potential decarbonisation. But it's not just about the hardware; it's also software. As we improve the algorithms that control the sails, that improves performance, but also weather routing is really key. Ships already use weather routing to try and avoid bad weather, but then you can kind of start using the same technology to route the ship to optimize the wind performance of this technology to further reduce fuel use and still arrive on time. So there's lots of innovation that's making it get better and better.
Yeah.
Oh, that's really exciting. Love to talk about progress and hear what solutions are out there and what's being done. Which countries and companies do you see are putting the most time and money into researching and testing wind-assisted commercial shipping? And what are the big shipping companies that are doing most of it or a lot of it?
Yeah, so there's been quite a lot bubbling away quietly for the last 15 years or so, most of it in Europe, especially in the UK, France, Germany, Scandinavia, and also a bit in Spain. And not surprisingly, they're the places that I mainly visited on my Churchill Fellowship. Firstly, in the UK, Bar Technologies I mentioned, they have a really interesting history actually. A lot of their people really came from the America's Cup and Formula One car racing worlds. So they've got all the skills in computational fluid dynamics, modern composite materials. The technology they've developed has been installed on a number of bulk cargo ships, and they're massive wings with lots of power, super impressive. So I visited them in Portsmouth. Anemoy make Flettner rotors, and they're scaling. They've been one of the early players to scale their production capabilities in China. There are a bunch of Flettner rotor companies actually. Another one is Norse Power from Finland, and there's a ferry, for example, operating between northern Germany and Denmark using a Flettner rotor. But France is really approaching this in a really clever way. They see this as a national economic development opportunity. So some of the notable vessels include Canopé, which delivers Ariane space rockets from Europe to French Guiana for launch, using a French wing system called Ocean Wings. And the Ariane Group actually played a really key role in this innovation, using its procurement to drive this outcome. There's another company called TOUT, or Transoceanic Wind Transport, based in Le Havre in northern France. They have 2 vessels trading goods like chocolate and rum and perfume across the Atlantic. But yeah, they're growing their business. They're building 6 more vessels right now in Vietnam, and so they've got big aspirations to be operating globally using the wind. Another interesting vessel called Nearline, which is a roll-on, roll-off vessel. It was built in Turkey, just launched a few months ago. It's being commissioned right now. And essentially that will take cargo, including cars and trucks and forklifts and other goods from Europe to North America. And it uses another French innovation called solid sail, which was developed by a big shipyard in Brittany called Chantiers de l'Atlantique in Saint-Nazaire. And that the same technology is being installed on new cruise ships, like passenger cruise ships. The first one's called Orient Express Corinthian. And again, just highlight one location in France, which is very innovative, and that's Lorient. And so it's called the City of 5 Ports: military, fishing, commercial, passengers, and yachting. It's got deep capability in the maritime sector, and it's really fertile ground for innovation. And so again, unsurprisingly, there's a bunch of innovators there, including Zephyr and Bory, who are the operators of the Canopé vessel that I mentioned before, the rocket vessel, and another one called Windcop. And there are several factories there that make really large carbon fiber masts for different shipping companies. So yeah, again, just a real hotbed of innovation. Now, in terms of shipping companies, several of the larger, more cashed up shipping companies are actively playing around with this technology and starting to scale it. For example, Union Maritime, it's a British shipping company. They've invested into biotechnologies. They're announcing new vessels all the time. Eastern Pacific Shipping, they use suction sails from a Spanish company called Bound for Blue. And in Asia, MOL, Mitsui O.S.K. Lines from Japan, they've developed their own technology, and also they're deploying others' technologies alongside their own just to sort of trial them out. But there are also new shipping companies being created dedicated to wind-powered ships. Tout, for example, I mentioned before. Interestingly, very little coming out of the US. The US, as we all know, is sort of retreating back into being a petrostate, as other countries, especially China, sort of race to become electrostates and to deepen their decarbonisation. And also, innovation isn't just happening in the global north, it's also happening in the global south. There's lots happening in the Pacific, which I'll describe shortly.
Wow, there definitely is a lot happening. Like Murray, I'd love to see a sort of expo of them all, maybe even a race.
Yeah, exactly.
You mentioned a bit earlier about sort of, I think you said sails, which could fold down to allow ships to load and might get in the way, or, so it sounds like encouraging the uptake of wind-assisted tech or ships is not just about the ships itself. I mean, there's also port infrastructure and how they dock and load and maybe regulation or other things that need to be taken into account. So in addition to the ships themselves, that obviously really exciting, what else do we need to think about, or what else are they working on?
Yeah, during my trip, I actually visited the largest port in the world in Singapore, and also the largest port in Europe, the port of Rotterdam. Both ports have seen their first wind-powered ships come through, and they're taking steps to really understand and accommodate them because they see where it's sort of heading. Obviously, as port operators, they need comfort that these ships will be compatible with their normal operations and their infrastructure like cranes and so on. But with 100 wind-powered ships in operation by the end of this year, that level of comfort, and it's increasing. It'll be commonplace. But also, wind-powered ships don't have to operate from these massive ports that big ships operate from. They can also operate from secondary ports. For example, Tout, that I mentioned before, they've got their own onboard cranes, so they can operate with minimal port infrastructure, really just wharf space and forklifts. It makes it cheaper for them to offer their shipping as well, and they can go to more places. So it's really well suited to the Caribbean, to Africa, and across the Pacific where the facilities are less. And so again, looking across the supply chain, this is an industry where production capacity is growing. So there's more factories making the stuff ready to install, and less lead times. We're going up the learning curve, bringing down the costs, accumulating experience in deploying and operating them. we're getting clearer on ways to validate their performance once they're installed. And that's really key if, future financiers are going to put their money into these systems. And, there's a growing pipeline of new ships with this technology employed. So it's really sort of building up a head of steam, so to speak.
Head of steam. It's all happening. Wow. Yeah. You just mentioned that you visited the largest port in the world in Singapore. And I know that in your fellowship, you also visited the Marshall Islands, so a small island developing state with 24 inhabited islands. So obviously these contexts are very different in many ways. Can you talk a bit about how they are each looking at wind-assisted shipping differently and what benefits they're hoping for across these regions?
Yeah, I mean, they're really at opposite extremes. I mean, Singapore, again, is the biggest port in the world. But in March, before my fellowship, I actually flew up to Singapore for the Wind Propulsion Asia Summit, hosted by the International Windship Association, and it's part of Singapore Maritime Week. So Singapore is actually a very innovative place, and they're actively exploring new shipping technologies. And they helped set up the Global Centre for Maritime Decarbonising, which I visited during my fellowship.
Awesome.
And one of the innovations they're looking at is financing for these systems. Often smaller shipping companies don't have the capital to deploy these systems, and banks traditionally haven't sort of provided debt funding to install them. But now, they're working out ways to bring the model that's been pioneered in the real estate industry for energy efficiency tech that can be debt funded. So I think we'll start seeing more and more shipping companies with access to financing from banks to install this technology. So that's the big end. But in the Pacific, I spent 9 days in the Marshall Islands, and just for context, that's about halfway between Hawaii and Australia. It's a massive archipelago with a very small and dispersed population. So a sea area of about 2 million square kilometres and a land area of about 180 square kilometres, which is less than the size of Liechtenstein. It's got 29 atolls. It's about 24 inhabited atolls and islands, and a population of about 42,000 people, half of whom live on one atoll called Madro, which I visited and spent 9 days. The Marshall Islands and the Pacific generally actually have a very rich seafaring history. They developed really efficient and fast traditional sailing vessels. They had a really unique form of navigation, sort of sensing changes in wave patterns as waves reflect and refract around the islands in the Pacific. But they've lost a lot of these skills with modern ships and modern fuels. But the populations on the outer islands, away from Madro, they're heavily dependent on resupply of food and fuel and even moving people around, using a fleet of 7 old domestic ships, which burn a lot of fuel. And that's all imported, it's all expensive, and it's a drain on the company's finances. And I mean, frankly, the Pacific states face an existential threat from rising sea levels. The atolls are only several meters above sea level, and storm surges regularly inundate lots of land. And there was actually a tsunami alert just a few days after I left Madro. And it had occurred to me while I was there that, gosh, there's nowhere to go if there's a tsunami. It would just end very badly. It's no surprise then that the Marshall Islands and other Pacific islands are very ambitious with their maritime decarbonisation goals. So I also got a chance to learn about a program called the Low Carbon Sea Transport Project, funded by the German government since 2017. And it's sort of got three streams. Firstly, they're funding the development and construction of a new wind-powered cargo ship called the Duran-I, which has been operating for about a year, which I got on board. They're funding the
You got on board it?
Yeah, and I interviewed the skipper, and I'm actually really keen to get this vessel to Adelaide if we host COP31 in Adelaide.
Amazing.
That would be great.
Oh, that would be incredible.
So the Germans are also funding the reinvigoration of these traditional sailing craft and also building capacity for the Marshall Islands to send delegations to COP and International Maritime Organization events. So, by reducing the fuel costs of ships like the Duran-I to run on wind instead of fuel, essentially, it lowers the cost of operation. And that means they can resupply these outer islands more frequently, which improves the quality of life. They're more connected. And that's important because there's a big brain drain of young people out of the Pacific seeking better lives. And this is a way to hopefully sort of start turning that around. But there's also potential for new shipping between different Pacific states. And I've got one good example. When I was in Majuro, it's really expensive to buy fresh food because there's not much land. It's very hard to grow. But in the Federated States of Micronesia, the state of Pohnpei, they actually grow food very readily. So in theory, it's possible to send fresh food from Pohnpei to Majuro, and in return, Majuro can send back copra cake, which is processed coconut, basically. They can send it from Majuro back to Pohnpei, where they need it for pig feed. It's really desirable. So this trade doesn't happen right now because shipping fuel is too expensive. But if you introduce new wind-powered ships, suddenly that becomes possible. And there must be lots of examples like that across the Pacific.
I can imagine. Do you know if the Durrani is going to be operational transporting cargo around the Pacific? Is it already?
It already is. Yeah. It's part of the Marshall Islands domestic cargo fleet. So it's used to resupply the outer islands. Yeah.
So, Andrew, what can be done to encourage wind-assisted shipping, especially in the Pacific? What else is needed? Are there signs that these technologies are being explored at the pace and scale that we need, or what else needs to be done?
I mean, for context, Australia doesn't have its own shipping lines anymore. We sold, the Australian government sold the Australian National Line in 1998 to the French company CMA-CGM, who I visited in Marseille. We mostly have overseas shipping companies servicing our shipping needs. With container ships for imported goods, as I mentioned before, it's the most difficult use case for wind assistance. And with exports of commodities, grain and coal and iron ore, it is definitely possible, but it depends on the destination. If it's going up through the Indonesian archipelago up to North Asia, the wind is kind of okay, but not great. It's not ideal. But if going across the Atlantic or Pacific, it's generally more suitable. So, we're starting to see a bit of interest in LNG carriers. Chevron and MOL from Japan, they're chartering an LNG carrier that has MOL's own technology. But really, in my view, the main focus for Australia should be the Pacific, particularly if COP31 lands in Australia, because it'll be the Pacific COP. It's all about the Pacific.
Yeah.
But that's a big if Australia is selected ahead of Turkey, so it hasn't been decided yet. What could Australia do? Well, quite a lot, I think. So we could fund and support either just by ourselves or with other countries. For example, through a multilaterally funded COP initiative, we could construct a new vessel like the Durrani, either in the Marshall Islands or in another Pacific state, and there is growing interest. We could also fund the design and construction of an Australian designed sail powered cargo vessel. And there's a really good company called Go Sail Cargo they've designed a whole bunch of designs that are very suitable in the Pacific. And we could construct them in Australian yards, use Australian service providers like Daval Architects, etc., to have more economic outcomes in Australia. We could fund the charter of a vessel like the Tout vessel I mentioned before, which will be ready early next year, which is bigger than the Durrani and could operate more broadly across the Pacific, and it carries more tonnage, about 1,200 tons. And a charter comes with a crew, so you don't have the lead time of having to train new people. But of course, that provides an opportunity to train people on the job, on the crew.
Yeah.
So another example, we could fund electric outboard motors and batteries and solar charging stations. And there is an Australian company called E-Class Outboards that develops those. And they'd be great on the outer islands to replace petrol outboards, because petrol is super expensive on these outer islands. And then even we could actually deliver training for mariners. And the Australian Maritime College has really good capability that we could expand through the Pacific for these new class of vessels. So, there's a lot we can do.
So many opportunities. Yeah.
Andrew, there's a lot of innovation obviously going on in this sector, and that's very familiar territory to you, that area of innovation. You've worked on lots of groundbreaking projects and technologies. I imagine it requires a special mindset to be good at bringing these sorts of projects to life, an ability to think innovatively and to be flexible in your thinking. What's your advice to others who are working on cutting edge technologies or projects?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, I'd say stay curious and follow your passions. And really, that's what a Churchill Fellowship is all about. I would say that no experience is wasted. I've done a lot of very different things, from the Navy to organising big events for the Dalai Lama, suicide prevention, etc. But they've all come together in my career and have taken me to some really interesting places. So nothing's wasted. And really, I mean, a career ethos which works for me is working in great teams, doing worthwhile things. So I'm happiest when I'm working with really good people, and I'm happiest when that work aligns with my own values and interests. And then finally, my wife and I have both studied permaculture, which is essentially a series of ethics and design principles for sustainable agriculture and communities. And one of the design principles is use edges and value the marginal. So this highlights how the edges where two systems meet, like a forest and a field, or land and water, even social and cultural boundaries, they're often the most productive. They're diverse and dynamic zones. In ecology, they're areas where that support more species than the areas they separate. So there's lots of innovation potential at the edges, and that's really the way I guess I've sought to live my life and where I've had the most sort of success in my career.
Yeah, that's great advice, Andrew. And I love that concept of working in the sort of intertidal zone of thinking. Finally, one last question. What fact do you wish was more widely known because it would help us move faster to a cleaner, greener, better world?
I've reached the point where I believe that bottom-up decarbonisation is probably more important than top-down decarbonisation. So, heroic scale projects don't always happen, as I only know too well from my own career. I've really invested a lot of my time and energy into these heroic scale projects, a number of which have never really, got built in the end. So that was kind of wasted. So I'm becoming more interested in bottom-up decarbonisation in consumer-led activities that can scale and empower. For example, with solar PV, more than half the homes now in Adelaide have solar panels, and South Australia, the whole state of South Australia, is sometimes powered entirely by rooftop solar panels. We have solutions that we need to drive our emissions down. Our challenge is to scale them quickly. So obviously wind and solar generation, especially solar that can install cheaply and scale quickly. Batteries, we're seeing a real proliferation now of batteries, both utility scale and also in homes. Australia is currently installing about 1,000 home batteries a day, about 20 megawatt hours of capacity a day. And really, energy storage is the holy grail, remembering that all that fossil fuels are is a form of energy storage in chemical form. That's all they are, energy storage. Electric vehicles, they're much larger batteries than home batteries. For example, my EV has more than 6 times the storage capacity as my home battery. So it's a really convenient place to soak up, lots of cheap, free daytime solar. During my Churchill trip, I took a side trip to Utrecht in the Netherlands to see a citywide vehicle-to-grid installation where cars can send their power back to the grid to support it when the grid needs it most, typically in the evenings, and to earn new revenue for the EV owners. And I'm now helping work with others to help bring this technology to Australia. And of course, induction cooktops, heat pumps, there's lots of stuff that we can do ourselves in our own homes to get off gas and to go fully electric, because really it's a gift that keeps giving. And of course, not forgetting wind-powered commercial shipping. This can also scale quickly. It can be used for massive shipping companies on global routes, but also more locally in the Pacific. It can really have a big impact, both economically, environmentally, and socially. So again, there's cause for optimism. We just need to crack on and scale these technologies that we already have, which are getting cheaper and better all the time. So if COP31 comes to Adelaide, it should be an action COP rather than just an agreement COP. So rapidly scaling the technologies we already have. That's
wonderful. Thanks so much, Andrew. Really appreciate it. And that was really fascinating. Thanks very much. Those were some great insights that Andrew had to share. There'd be very few people in the world who have Andrew's comprehensive knowledge of the state of play in wind-assisted commercial shipping. Now it's time to talk to Mark Tilley, Asia Pacific editor with Carbon Pulse and Biodiversity Pulse. Mark's going to talk about the international policy and regulatory activity on shipping emissions.
Hello, Mark, and welcome to Track Changes.
Hi, Francisca. It's thanks for having me again. It's good to be back.
Now, Francisca, you have to boast about your maritime connections here. But yes, I'm so no, talk about your time.
I love sailing, Mark, and I sailed a lot in PNG when I lived there a few years ago. But my initial sailing journey was my entrance to sailing was this Navy-run training program for young people, which is the Young Endeavour, and it's a tall ship that's something like 45 meters long.
Oh, wow.
And they take you out for 10 days on the open ocean and teach you how to, sail a ship that's got 2 masts and giant yard sails, giant horizontal square sails, and not capsize or break it. So do think this is an exciting and interesting topic.
No, I come from a big sailing family myself, actually.
Really?
Yeah, I used to do Sea Scouts as a kid, and they took us out on a similar tall ship for day trips called the Lewin, which is in Western Australia.
Oh, so cool.
Yeah, and my mum's I got family who've been in Sydney to Hobart yacht races and have chartered ships around the world and that sort of thing. So yeah, it's very dear to my heart as well. It's in the blood, as they say.
We'll jump straight in with a sort of bigger picture question. International shipping related emissions aren't included in the nationally determined contributions of countries under the Paris Agreement. Can you tell us a bit more about this, or should it be included and why?
Shipping and aviation emissions aren't included in a lot of countries' nationally determined contributions because they are governed by separate UN frameworks that are set out to decarbonize those specific sectors. For the aviation sector, they're ICAO's, that's the International Civil Aviation Authority. And then the marine sector, they have the International Maritime Organization. So those two UN bodies have their own specific frameworks to decarbonize, laying out pathways to decarbonize. But there is an increasing focus on some countries to include shipping and aviation emissions as part of their domestic sort of decarbonization goals, even though it's not necessarily considered under the UN National Determined Contributions Framework. I think that's because they want to try and sort of incentivize some of the potential benefits that come from decarbonizing those sectors in terms of, clean fuel development and new sort of technology opportunities that could arise from decarbonization. So yeah, and also because some of the richer nations around the world are basically saying, well, it's kind of our responsibility as a wealthy nation to sort of put forward those options or set those ambitions higher than perhaps they could have been otherwise.
Okay, so you're saying if they were brought into NDCs, it would create different incentivization, maybe see more progress from some countries.
Well, not specifically NDCs, but so the one example that I'm most familiar with is New Zealand. So the Climate Change Commission last year argued that the maritime and aviation emissions should be counted under its domestic target. So that's separate from its international one.
Okay.
I'm not entirely sure about how they are. How many countries are looking to incorporate those into the NDCs themselves. But I guess we'll find out very soon as countries start to sort of roll out the next wave of NDCs that are coming up.
Absolutely. And you mentioned a bit about the International Maritime Organization. Could you expand on that and the IMO's role in this space?
Yes. So the IMO is the international body that governs the marine sector, so all the ships that sail internationally around the world. And so they are responsible for managing the global shipping sector's emissions, which is roughly around 2% of the world's total greenhouse gas emissions.
And it's my understanding they've got targets. Do you happen to know what those are and their sort of level of ambition?
Yeah, so they have a goal to get to net zero emissions by 2050. In April, the IMO member countries established this new framework to drive that decarbonisation. So it involves a carbon crediting scheme, what's known as a baseline and crediting scheme, that will mean that shipping companies are essentially going to have to pay for the CO2 that is produced from their vessels after increasing after a certain threshold. So it's what's known in carbon language as a baseline and credit scheme. Based on this scheme, they're looking to reduce the carbon intensity of their marine fuels by around 17% by 2028, and then 21% by 2030, and then 43% by 2035, and that's below 2008 levels, I think. So it's setting that trajectory.
Progressive.
Interim
targets. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not. So there was in April they agreed to this framework. It's not as ambitious as some countries wanted it to be.
Mm-hmm.
Tuvalu and the Pacific Islands weren't particularly happy with it. They wanted a global levy, just like a flat fee to chart, like basically a CO2 tax, because they argued that it would raise more money that would help decarbonize the shipping sector, but also compensate countries being most affected by climate change. The agreed framework that they have set out that has been agreed to but is yet to be adopted, it's expected to raise between 11 and $13 billion a year from 2028 once it starts collecting fees.
Okay, from 2028. To align with the IMO's interim targets.
Yes.
Awesome. We've just heard about some exciting innovations in wind-assisted shipping. Are there any other innovations you think we should be watching, and who's doing them?
There's a few ideas going around to decarbonize shipping fuels. Some I'd say would probably be more contentious than others. Some countries and some shipping groups are looking to use LNG because they can be dropped in with conventional fuels. But there's a big pushback against this because obviously that would prolong the use of LNG, which is of course a fossil fuel, for longer. But there are other alternatives such as green methanol or green ammonia. They are considered to be more ambitious and can cut emissions much more substantially. At the moment, there are 60 methanol-capable vessels in operation around the world, and there are 300 on order. So that kind of gives you an idea of the actual sort of direction that the industry is heading in terms of looking to these kinds of technologies as a way to sort of cut the emissions from their ships. But at the same time, there are still some pretty big challenges with some of those fuels, methanol and ammonia, namely the lack of bunkering infrastructure, which is bunkering is in places to store the fuel. Methanol, for example, also has a lower energy intensity, meaning ships would have to refuel more often. But also the largest hurdle with specifically methanol at the moment is there is a lack of renewable methanol production globally. It's still sort of very much in its early stages. Ammonia is the other fuel being looked at, and apparently it delivers something like a 95% tank to wake emissions reduction. Again, though, they're having some issues in terms of the lack of supply and infrastructure. But also ammonia as a substance is very, very toxic, which means that crews would need to be specially trained to handle it. Another sort of big sort of issue with these decisions on sort of which technology to choose and which options to sort of ways to retrofit a ship is that these are very, very long life assets. The ships that are being built today, they will have a lifespan of 25 to 30 years, meaning that a decision made today could lock in decades more fossil fuel emissions in the future, or lock in more inefficiencies if the wrong technology type is chosen, or so there's a lot of things to consider, I suppose you could say.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a interesting challenge with long life assets like that. Curious to know the role of Australia in all of this. why do Australian businesses care, and what contributions are Australian industries making in this space? Do we have a pipeline for the fuels needed for this transition?
So yeah, a lot of companies, specifically mining companies, are looking at options to decarbonize their fleets, because obviously they rely on ships to get commodities like iron ore to customers, countries in the Asia Pacific and globally. So yeah, there are quite so the major miners like BHP and Rio Tinto, and like they're looking to use biofuels potentially for their shipping, but also for their broader mining operations. So their big, their mining trucks, their haulage trucks, and their vehicle fleets in places where it might be tricky to electrify. So yeah, there are steps that they are taking in that direction, going toward the biofuels. Fortescue is another example, is looking at the same thing. Fortescue's actually produced, they've retrofitted a vessel already. It's a dual fuel vessel that runs on ammonia. I actually got the opportunity to visit it.
Oh, really?
In
cool.
Dubai a couple of years ago during at COP. They had it on as a sort of
During COP, cool.
test case. Yes, but actually another interesting issue was that came up with it was that it was actually running at the time on some form of vegetable oil, I think, because there's no they don't have appropriate regulations in the UAE to run the ship off ammonia at this current time. So there's it kind of speaks to how so it speaks to not only sort of the technical and infrastructure hurdles that need to be overcome, but also the regulatory and legal frameworks as well.
Interesting. And I suppose all maritime shipping is probably in most Australian businesses scope 3, or probably all large Australian businesses scope 3 emissions. And with mandatory reporting, they'd be thinking about how to estimate these better, and also, depending on how material they are, how to decarbonize.
Mark, if I could just ask you a few more questions. So the IMO has come up with this new regime. I mean, does this mean the issue's sort of done and dusted from a regulatory policy perspective, or are there still tasks to be done to bring it into play, and are there still any opportunities to make it more ambitious?
It has been agreed to, but it has not been adopted yet. So in October, next month, the IMO will meet up again, and they will actually endorse it. It needs a 2/3 majority to be formally adopted, and so it's that is a crucial step that needs to be taken for it to actually come into effect and begin sort of being rolled out. Throwing a spanner in the works, as is now usually the case when it comes to climate matters, is the Trump administration, which last month issued a statement rejecting the agreed framework. They argued it was unfairly imposing burdens on citizens, energy providers, and shipping companies, and they argued that the sector should embrace existing technologies like LNG, but also biofuels. So in terms of how much influence that has on the final outcome, remains to be seen. I mean, I guess you could argue that it would make it easier for some countries to then go ahead and decide not to vote, because they could just, follow the US's example. At the same time, it's interesting because experts that we've spoken to highlighted that it was a bit of a shift, given that in Trump's first term in office, he wasn't necessarily interested in engaging in international climate agreements. He kind of just left them alone, except for obviously what happened with him pulling out of the Paris Agreement. But now in his second term, his government appears to be more willing to intentionally go after these international frameworks like the IMO. In terms of opportunities to improve it, I think there's quite a few, some of the details that need to be worked out. and I guess it's all going to be sort of will likely be, some of that will be hammered out in the talks that are coming up in October.
Sure. Okay. And you mentioned that, Pacific Island nations were very active in trying to get a decent outcome. Could you expand on sort of the differences in terms of ambition and approach between what they were pushing for, and how have they responded to what actually emerged? Have they said, are they taking a sort of, we'll cut our losses and vote this up in October, or are they sending mixed signals as well?
Well, as I said, they actually abstained from voting when the framework was agreed to in April,
right. Yep.
because they didn't believe that it was ambitious enough. I mean, yeah, they've acknowledged, and I think a lot of experts have acknowledged, that the framework that was agreed to in April is a pretty significant step in terms of, a tangible framework that places a price on emissions for the shipping sector, and, the volume of money that's going to be raised. I mean, it's not as big as it could have been, but it's still it's seemingly quite significant. And so, yeah, it's going to be interesting. So I think, there were comments being made by Pacific leaders at the time when it was agreed to, that like they acknowledged that it was an important step, but it still wouldn't be enough in terms of what they need, and obviously what they face as which is the sort of existential threat that climate change imposes. At the same time, I think some islands in the Pacific have some unique quirks to their negotiating positions, because specifically the Cook Islands, I'm pretty sure, because they have a lot of vessels that are flagged with them under their national sort of carrier fleet, I suppose you could say. A lot of international companies use the Cook Islands to flag their vessels for various reasons. And reportedly for a while they were sort of quite recalcitrant at imposing ambitious, or what they would see as burdensome, decarbonization targets on the shipping sector. But countries like Tuvalu are generally the more progressive, more ambitious, more sort of forward-facing, sort of calling for more steps to be taken, a bigger push, and a bigger more money to be raised, basically, to try and tackle this problem.
Yeah. I have this vague memory of a few COPs back. There was a thing called the Green Shipping Corridors Initiative launched. I think that's right. So I'm just wondering if there's particular routes where we're likely to see decarbonisation action emerge, maybe Australia, Singapore, or maybe Australia to its iron ore customers, because you did mention the work that's going on by some of the mining companies. Do you think we're going to see a sort of uneven spread as these new technologies, various types of new technologies, are trialled on particular routes, or between trading partners who are particularly willing to embrace the task of decarbonising shipping?
Well, yeah, as you mentioned, Singapore and Australia is one example of that, one of those green carbon agreements. I think when it was originally struck, it was, I think, at sort of the height of the hydrogen hype sort of heyday, I guess you could say. I think, there was a lot, when it was agreed to, there was, I think, a lot of the language around that was talking about sort of the potential of green hydrogen. It's obviously not quite yet lived up to expectations in terms of technology and costs and deployment and the like. Another example in that case is, I think, Australia and Rotterdam. So Fortescue and the government, Australian government, have been working for some time with the port of Rotterdam, which is in the Netherlands, to supply hydrogen through, like, as is basically a hub for supplying hydrogen initially, I think the thought was that they could, Australian companies could somehow transport hydrogen, like renewable hydrogen from Australia to Rotterdam to then it be then turned into derivative feedstocks that could be used for industry. And it's this sort of like, as you say, sort of a industrial sort of decarbonization platform. It's still in the works in terms of there's still movement in that space. But I guess you could, it could potentially, it does, I guess, highlight that these are examples between countries that are, wealthy, industrialized, and perhaps that means it could be seen as an example of it being benefiting those richer nations rather than the ones that don't necessarily have the funds available to them, basically, to invest in those kinds of technologies and efforts to decarbonize. I think, that was also an issue that the Pacific countries had with the framework that was agreed to, is that they argued that the framework as it was set out would basically underwrite richer countries' ability to decarbonize their shipping fleets at the expense of poorer ones.
Yeah.
So there's there's a lot of movement in the space, but there's also a lot of contention as well.
I mean, I suppose to look at it, maybe through rose-colored glasses, having this agreement in April, whatever its flaws might be, and then given that, not that I follow it closely, but we've got a regime in place now for airlines, international air travel, that pretty much locks away, most of the major sources of emissions, doesn't it? Because you've got things happening nationally. For quite a while, there was nothing really being done to capture international air travel, international shipping. But now that we do have these mechanisms, semi-lockdown or lockdown, semi-lockdown in the case of maritime, lockdown in the case of international air travel. So that's a bit of an advance, isn't it? That's quite a significant advance.
It is, but it also remains to be seen if these schemes are actually work in terms of delivering the emissions reductions that we need. There's a lot of emissions pricing and emissions trading schemes around the world globally that have yet to deliver tangible results. I mean, there are some that are in place that are delivering, obviously, but then globally emissions are still rising. So it's I think that it'll be proof will be in the pudding, as they say.
Yeah, and we have to wait for a few years to see
exactly
the pudding.
Exactly.
Yeah. So maybe, Mark, you could just elaborate a bit more on how the pricing structure is going to work in the IMO scheme.
Yeah, sure. So shipping companies will have to pay for their carbon dioxide that are produced by their vessels, which increases after a certain threshold. So there are two emissions baselines, or tiers as they're referred to, that shipping companies will have to abide by. Those that emit above the higher tier, known as tier 2, will have to pay $380 per ton per unit, while those that emit above the lower tier, or tier 1, will have to only pay $100 per ton. And then those that emit below that for tier 1, they are considered under their emissions baselines or tiers, meaning that they will be rewarded with units that can then be traded with other companies to meet those compliance obligations.
Okay, all right. So that's quite a sort of classic trading scheme arrangement with a few added levels of complexity. Okay, Mark. Well, look, thanks very much for chatting to us both. Those are really great insights, and look forward to talking again soon.
Always a pleasure, Maury and Francisco. Great to chat.
Well, they were wonderful chats with Andrew and Mark. I really learned a lot from them. One of the things I was most impressed with Andrew's chat was, just that reminder that solving climate change, tackling climate change, reducing emissions, it requires people to think innovatively, to be prepared to think innovatively, really dedicate themselves to something, for what can be quite a few years. And then sometimes it can require them to they need to come to a point where they decide, this is not the right way forward at this time. It may well be down the track, but I'm going to try something new. And that is exactly what Andrew has done. He's an innovator, but he's also flexible in his thinking. So I really enjoyed that about the interview. What about you, Francisca?
Me too. Yeah, Andrew really struck me as someone who has had a values-driven career that is targeting these big things, and has arrived at different bottom-up solutions, grassroots solutions across his time. And I think he shows resilience in the face of the climate challenge, which is really inspiring. Yeah, I also appreciated hearing from Mark and that bird's eye perspective of the policy landscape or the regulatory landscape that's changing around shipping, and kind of appreciating there is a lot going on. And there's so many different solutions, complex solutions that are being done by, different actors. And hopefully we can see an iterative, incremental increase in ambition and progress over time to meet those IMO interim targets.
Okay, well, thanks very much for joining us. If you liked the episode, don't forget to rate it on your favorite podcast platform. And we'll see you next time. Bye.
Thanks for joining us. Bye.